The last time anyone saw the Kinsley brothers was on a July afternoon in 1997, walking back toward the forest in their Boy Scout uniforms. When a severe storm hit, it was assumed the boys were tragically lost to nature's fury. Belief that comforted no one yet brought the official search to a close. But 11 years later, the clang of a logger's machine hitting a buried shipping container would finally break the case open, revealing a sinister truth hidden just beneath the forest floor. The sky over the state forest was turning a bruised, sickly color, long before the sun was due to set on July 12, 1997. Inside the Kinsley residence, situated near the forest's edge, the shifting light initially went unnoticed. It was the silence in the house, the absence of two specific voices that first registered as wrong. Mira Kinsley checked the clock again. Her sons 13-year-old Ronan and 11-year-old Jarek were late. The boys had spent the afternoon at a scheduled Boy Scout troop meeting, a routine gathering held at a clearing just inside the forest perimeter. The meeting had concluded hours ago. By now, Ronan and Jarek should have been home, shedding their uniforms and demanding snacks. Ronan, the elder, was typically responsible, recognizable in his tan. Short-sleeved shirt and dark shorts, his blonde hair neatly parted. Jarek, quieter and more observant, wore the olive-green, long-sleeved variant of the uniform, a unique circular pendant hanging from the red cord around his neck. They were inseparable, bound by more than just brotherhood. They shared an intense curiosity about the sprawling wilderness that began practically at their doorstep. Mira mentioned their tardiness to her husband, Finine. Initially, the concern was mild. Perhaps the meeting ran long, or they had stopped at a friend's house. But as another 30 minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the house began to change, mirroring the rapidly deteriorating weather outside. The wind was picking up significantly, rattling the windows with a low, insistent moan. The forecast had mentioned a chance of rain, but this felt different. It felt heavier, more aggressive. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop, creating a palpable tension in the air. Fenian stepped outside. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and the air carried the thick, metallic smell of an imminent downpour. The trees bordering their property were thrashing violently. This wasn't a summer shower. It was a severe, fast-moving storm front. The realization shifted the parents' worry into a sharp, cold panic. If the boys were still out there, they were exposed. They began making calls. First to the scoutmaster. He confirmed the meeting had ended on time around 3:30 p.m. He mentioned having taken a group photo earlier that day, capturing the boys standing formally on a dirt path, holding their wide-brimmed hats, a moment of calm before the storm broke. He hadn't seen Ronan or Jarek since the troop dispersed. Calls to other parents yielded the same result. The Kinsley brothers had seemingly vanished after the meeting concluded. With the storm now breaking, rain beginning to lash down in horizontal sheets, Mira and Fenian made the agonizing decision to contact the local sheriff's department. They officially reported Ronan and Jarek Kinsley missing. The words felt surreal, disconnected from the reality of their lives. Authorities arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the deluge. But their ability to act was immediately hampered by the ferocity of the weather. Visibility was near zero, and the noise of the wind and rain made communication difficult. They needed information, a starting point. They began interviewing the other boys from the troop, hoping someone knew where the brothers might have gone. The crucial piece of information came from Wesley Prather, a close friend of the brothers. Wesley told investigators that Ronan and Jarek had no intention of going straight home. They had a plan. According to Wesley, the brothers had recently discovered a hidden cave deep within a less-traveled section of the Oak Haven forest. They were excited about it, treating it as their secret headquarters. They had planned to re-enter the woods immediately after the meeting to spend more time exploring it. Wesley hadn't gone with them. He had noticed the sky darkening and the wind rising and decided to head home instead. He recalled urging the Kinsley brothers to do the same, but Ronan, emboldened by his recent scouting achievements and the thrill of adventure, had insisted they would be fine. He watched them walk away, disappearing back into the trees, while everyone else headed for the parking lot. This revelation provided a destination, but it was a terrifying one. The cave, as described by Wesley, was remote, situated miles from the meeting point. If the boys had attempted the hike, they would have been deep in the wilderness when the storm hit its peak. The implications were grim. The authorities hypothesized that the brothers were likely seeking shelter, perhaps in the cave itself or worse, had suffered an accident in the treacherous conditions, but knowing where they were and reaching them were two different things. The storm was raging with an intensity rarely seen in the region during the summer. The trails were turning to mudslides, and the risk of falling trees made entering the forest a life-threatening endeavor, even for trained personnel. There would be no full-scale search until the weather broke. For Myra and Finian Kinsley, the night of July 12th was defined by the howling wind and the unbearable weight of waiting. The assumption was that the boys were lost, cold and fighting for their lives against the elements. The storm raged throughout the night, an unrelenting assault of wind and water that seemed to shake the foundations of the Kinsley home. Sleep was impossible. Mira and Finan could only watch the clock and imagine the conditions their sons might be enduring. The Oak Haven State Forest was vast, encompassing thousands of acres of dense woodland, steep ravines, and winding creeks. It was easy to get lost in broad daylight. In the midst of a tempest, it was a death trap. The thought of their sons alone in the darkness, exposed to the fury of the storm, was a constant, agonizing torment. At the first hint of gray light on the morning of July 13th, the search operation mobilized. The scale was massive, involving local law enforcement, state police, park rangers, and hundreds of volunteers from the community. The trailhead parking lot where the Boy Scout meeting had taken place was transformed into a bustling command center. The air was still heavy and wet, but the wind had subsided, allowing the searchers to finally enter the woods. The environment they encountered was unrecognizable. The storm had fundamentally altered the landscape. Trails that had been clear paths the day before were now choked with debris. Ancient trees had been ripped from the earth, their massive root systems exposed like skeletal hands. Creeks that were normally ankle-deep had swollen into raging torrents, carving new paths through the forest floor. The ground itself was a thick, sucking mud that made every step an exertion. The primary focus of the search was the area between the scout meeting point and the location of the cave. Wesley Prather, despite his youth and the trauma of the situation, accompanied a team of experienced trackers to guide them toward the secret spot. The journey was arduous. The terrain leading to the cave was naturally rugged, characterized by rocky outcrops and dense underbrush, and the storm damage made it exponentially more difficult to navigate. The searchers worked in organized grid patterns, calling the boys names, the sound swallowed by the dense, wet foliage. They used ropes to cross flooded areas and chainsaws to clear paths. The physical toll was immense. The volunteers, driven by a desperate hope of finding the boys alive, pushed themselves to the brink of exhaustion. The first day of the search yielded nothing. As darkness fell, the teams were forced to retreat, disheartened and frustrated. The temperature dropped, adding the risk of hypothermia to the list of dangers the boys faced if they were still out there. The second day, July 14th, the search resumed with renewed intensity. Specialized teams equipped with climbing gear and mapping technology pushed deeper into the remote areas Wesley had indicated. The terrain here was rugged, characterized by steep inclines and rocky outcrops, making the journey even more difficult. It was late in the afternoon on the second day when a breakthrough finally occurred. A search team located a cave matching the description provided by Wesley. It was situated in a remote ravine, its entrance partially obscured by a landslide of mud and rock triggered by the heavy rains. The sight of it immediately dampened the spirits of the search party. It was difficult to access, and the surrounding area showed clear signs of violent water movement. Investigators cautiously entered the cave. It was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The first priority was to determine if the boys had actually made it this far. The cave floor was covered in a thick layer of fresh silt, making the search for footprints or dropped items nearly impossible. The search seemed to be hitting a dead end until one of the trackers noticed something near the entrance. It wasn't a belonging or a piece of clothing. It was a knot. Tied securely to an exposed root system near the cave opening was a length of red cord identical to the type used in the Boy Scout uniforms. The cord had been fashioned into a complex, intricate knot. It was immediately recognized as a specialized scouting knot, one knot typically known by junior members. Wesley Prather was brought to the site to examine it. His reaction was immediate. He confirmed that this specific knot, a variation of a friction hitch, was something Ronan Kinsley had only recently mastered. Ronan had been intensely proud of this achievement, practicing it incessantly, and showing it off to the other scouts. According to Wesley, Ronan was likely the only boy in their troop capable of tying it correctly under pressure. The discovery of the knot was pivotal. It strongly suggested that the Kinsley brothers had reached their destination shortly before the storm hit its peak. It seemed like a marker, perhaps left by Ronan to signify their arrival, or even as a practice exercise while waiting for the rain to start. Why they left the cave, or what happened next, remained a mystery. The physical evidence inside the cave pointed toward a grim scenario. Along with the silt on the floor, investigators noted debris leaves, twigs, and mud lodged high on the cave walls, several feet above the heads of the searchers. This was a high-water mark, clear evidence that the cave had experienced significant, sudden flooding during the storm. The ravine outside had acted as a funnel, channeling the torrential runoff directly into the opening. The prevailing theory began to solidify, and it was devastating. Authorities believed the boys had been caught in a flash flood within the confines of the cave. The force of the water would have been overwhelming, giving them little chance of escape. The alternative theory was only slightly less horrific. Perhaps they saw the water rising and attempted to flee, only to become hopelessly lost and disoriented in the surrounding wilderness during the height of the storm. The discovery of the knot focused the search efforts, but it did not make the task any easier. The search radius was expanded significantly around the cave area. Divers were brought in to search the swollen creeks and temporary ponds created by the floodwaters. K-9 units specialized in tracking and cadaver detection crisscrossed the terrain. The community mobilized with an intensity born of shared grief and the desperate hope of finding the boys alive. Weeks dragged on. The summer heat returned, baking the mud dry and making the air thick and humid. The media attention gradually faded, and the number of volunteers dwindled. The physical toll on the search teams was immense, but the emotional toll was even greater. Despite the most exhaustive search operation in the region's history, no further trace of Ronan or Jarrett Kinsley was found. No clothing, no equipment, nothing. It was as if the storm had simply washed them away. The absence of any evidence outside the cave reinforced the belief that they had perished in the flood. Their bodies perhaps buried under tons of silt, or carried miles downstream into inaccessible marshland. The investigation stalled. There were no suspects, no signs of foul play. The knot at the cave entrance was interpreted as the last artifact of a tragic accident. For Mira and Feenan Kinsley, the uncertainty was a torment. They held memorials without bodies, clinging to the faint hope that their sons might one day be found. The case of the Kinsley brothers was officially declared cold. It was categorized as a tragic accident, a case of two adventurous boys caught in an unforgiving act of nature. The Oak Haven State Forest kept its secrets, and the story of the vanished Boy Scouts became a local legend, a cautionary tale told around campfires. Life in the community moved on, but the scar remained, a wound that refused to heal. 11 years passed. The narrative shifts to October 2008. The Oak Haven State Forest remained largely unchanged. A vast expanse of wilderness that resisted human encroachment. The story of the Kinsley brothers had faded into local lore, a tragic footnote in the history of the region. However, economic pressures had led the state to open up new, previously inaccessible sections of the forest for logging operations. One such area, located deep within the forest, miles beyond the perimeter of the 1997 search area, was being actively harvested. The noise was deafening. Heavy machinery chewed through the dense woodland, the roar of chainsaws and the grinding gears of skidders echoing through the trees. A logging crew was working against a tight deadline, clearing a tract of land that had been virtually untouched for decades. The work was grueling, the terrain rugged, and the isolation complete. They were deep in the woods, far from any paved road, in an area where cell phone signals were non-existent. Garrick Vane was operating a feller buncher, a massive machine designed to cut and gather multiple trees simultaneously. He was an experienced logger, accustomed to the rhythms of the forest and the resistance of the earth. But on this particular afternoon, as he cleared a dense patch of underbrush near a natural depression in the terrain, his machine struck something that didn't yield. It wasn't the dull thud of a buried rock or the yielding resistance of a root system. It was the sharp ringing clang of metal on metal. Garrick stopped the machine, the engine idling. He climbed down from the cab to investigate. The object was buried beneath a thick layer of topsoil, pine needles, and decaying leaves. It looked like it had been intentionally camouflaged, covered with brush and debris that had accumulated over the years. He kicked at the dirt, exposing a small section of rusted metal. It appeared to be flat, perhaps a sheet of corrugated iron. He called over a couple of his colleagues. They gathered around the discovery, curious and slightly annoyed by the interruption. They helped him clear away the dirt and brush, using shovels to gradually reveal the object beneath. It wasn't a sheet of metal. It was a hatch, a large square metal hatch, heavily rusted and pitted with age. It was set into a larger structure that seemed to be buried deep in the earth. The discovery was unsettling. This area was remote, miles from any human habitation. There was no reason for a buried structure to be here. The initial assumption was that it might be an old septic tank or a forgotten root cellar, but the location made no sense. Garrick tried to lift the hatch. It was heavy, and the hinges were seized with rust. Using a crowbar, the loggers managed to pry it open. The hatch groaned open, revealing a dark, cavernous opening leading down into the earth. A stale, musty smell wafted up from the darkness, the scent of decay, mold, and damp earth. They peered into the opening. They couldn't see much, but the shape of the structure was becoming clear. It wasn't a tank or a cellar. It was a shipping container, deliberately buried in the ground. A heated debate broke out among the crew. Garrick's colleagues urged him to ignore the find. They were already behind schedule, and involving the authorities would mean shutting down the operation, potentially for days. The delay would jeopardize their pay, and their boss was notoriously unforgiving about missed deadlines. They argued that it was probably just an old survivalist bunker or a hunter's cache, and it wasn't their business. "Let's just cover it back up and move on," the foreman insisted. But Garrick Vane was a father himself. The sight of the buried container, the darkness within, and the deliberate concealment filled him with a profound sense of unease. Something felt deeply wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something sinister. The effort required to bury something this large in such a remote location was significant. It felt hidden, felt like a secret that needed to be exposed. He made a decision. Ignoring the protests of his crew, he decided to report the discovery. The isolation of the site meant there was no cell service. Garrick had to drive his truck several miles down the rough logging roads, navigating the treacherous terrain until he reached a main road where he could get a signal. The drive felt agonizingly long, the silence in the truck amplifying his growing dread. He finally reached a spot where his phone showed a signal. He called the county sheriff's office and described what they had found. The sheriff's department, recognizing the unusual nature of the discovery and the remoteness of the location, dispatched deputies to the scene. They arrived hours later, guided by Garrick. The logging operation was halted. The area was secured, transformed from a work site into a potential crime scene. The deputies began the process of excavating the area around the container. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the use of the logging equipment to clear the earth that had encased the structure for years. As the dirt was removed, the full scale of the container was revealed. It was a massive shipping container, 40 feet long, buried in a deep trench. The entire visible surface was covered in thick, flaky layers of orange and brown rust.
Patches of bright green moss had taken root on its flat-top surface, further cementing its age and neglect. The scene was grim. The container sat in the muddy trench, a rusting sarcophagus unearthed from the forest floor. The initial inspection of the exterior suggested that the container had been buried for a very long time. The focus turned to the interior. The hatch was the only visible entrance. Investigators equipped with powerful flashlights and protective gear cautiously climbed down into the darkness. The descent felt like descending into a grave. The interior was a scene of decay and abandonment. It was clearly a makeshift living space, but it had not been occupied for years. The air was thick and foul, difficult to breathe. The flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a horrific tableau. 2 decaying mattresses lay on the floor, covered in mold and rodent droppings. The floor was littered with debris, empty food wrappers, crushed aluminum cans, and plastic bottles. The packaging styles and brand logos suggested they dated back to the late 1990s or early 2000s. The sheer volume of debris indicated a long-term habitation. It was clear that someone had lived here, perhaps for an extended period, but it was the nature of the items found that shifted the atmosphere from unsettling to horrifying. Scattered among the debris were items that seemed incongruous with an adult survivalist or hunter. They found several comic book issues, their pages warped and stained with moisture. Dating from 1997, a portable CD player, heavily corroded and long dead, lay near one of the mattresses with several CDs scattered nearby bands popular among teenagers in that era. The items suggested young occupants, a realization that sent a chill through the investigative team. The container was searched methodically, every item cataloged and photographed. The conditions were appalling, the environment hazardous due to the mold and rust. The investigators were working under the assumption that this might be a crime scene, but they had no context, no missing persons reports that matched the scenario. Then, amidst the decaying fabric of one of the mattresses, an investigator noticed a glint of metal. He carefully retrieved the object, his gloved hands brushing away the filth. It was a small circular metal pendant attached to a faded, frayed red cord. The pendant was tarnished, but its unique design was still visible. The object was bagged and brought out into the daylight for closer inspection. It seemed like a minor piece of evidence, perhaps insignificant, but standard procedure required that any unique items found at a potential crime scene be cross-referenced with cold case files. The pendant was processed, and its description entered into the state's missing persons database. The search parameters were broad, looking for any unsolved disappearances involving similar items. The process was painstaking, requiring a review of hundreds of cold case files. The system returned a match. The pendant was a perfect match for an item described in a missing persons report filed 11 years earlier. The report detailed the disappearance of two brothers, Ronan and Jarek Kinsley, in the Oak Haven State Forest in July 1997. The report specifically mentioned that Jarek Kinsley was wearing a unique circular pendant on a red cord when he vanished. A photograph included in the file, the same photograph taken by the scoutmaster on the day they disappeared, showed Jarek wearing the exact same pendant. The realization hit the investigative team like a physical blow. The buried container, the comic books, the mattresses, it all suddenly made a horrific kind of sense. They hadn't found a hunter's cache. They had found the place where the Kinsley brothers had been taken. The discovery immediately transformed the investigation. This was no longer a local matter. The implications of a long-term abduction, potentially spanning years, required specialized resources and expertise. The county sheriff immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The cold case of the vanished Boy Scouts had just burst wide open, revealing a darkness far greater than anyone had imagined. The discovery of the buried container deep within the Oak Haven State Forest triggered an immediate and massive response. Within 24 hours, the remote logging site was transformed into a major crime scene investigation. FBI agents arrived, their dark blue jackets emblazoned with the bold yellow letters FBI, standing in stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the forest. They secured the scene, establishing a strict perimeter and taking control of the investigation from the local authorities. The silence of the forest was replaced by the hum of generators and the crackle of radios. The Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, was consulted immediately. The nature of the discovery, a hidden underground bunker designed for long-term captivity, pointed toward a specific type of offender, one characterized by meticulous planning, patience, and a terrifying degree of organization. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully orchestrated operation. The first priority was a detailed analysis of the site itself. The container was photographed extensively, both inside and out. The FBI agents walked along the top of the rusted structure, assessing its construction and the logistics of its placement. It was immediately clear that this was not a hastily constructed shelter or a temporary hiding place. It was a prison designed and built with chilling premeditation. The container had been modified significantly before being buried. Investigators discovered a sophisticated, custom-built ventilation system. This was the most striking feature, revealing the perpetrator's meticulous planning and technical expertise. It wasn't just a simple air pipe. It consisted of a complex network of buried ducts, specialized fans, and filters designed to circulate air while remaining concealed from the surface. The intake and exhaust vents were located hundreds of feet away from the container, hidden within a dense thicket of brush. The system was intricate, suggesting a high degree of technical skill and knowledge of high-VX systems. The hatch, the only entry and exit point, had been reinforced with heavy steel bars and secured with multiple locking mechanisms. These were not standard locks. They were custom-made restraints designed specifically to prevent escape from the inside. There was no way for anyone inside the container to open the hatch without specialized tools. The realization confirmed the horrific reality. Ronan and Jarek Kinsley had not stumbled upon this place. They had been held captive here, buried alive in the darkness. The logistics of the operation were staggering. Burying a 40-foot shipping container in such a remote location required significant premeditation and the use of heavy equipment, excavators, bulldozers, perhaps even a crane. It was not something that could be accomplished quickly or quietly. It implied that the perpetrator had access to the area and the means to operate heavy machinery without drawing suspicion. While the behavioral analysts worked on profiling the offender, the forensic teams began the painstaking process of searching the container for evidence. They hoped to find DNA, fingerprints, hair, or any trace evidence that could identify the perpetrator or confirm the presence of the victims beyond the pendant. The work was slow and grueling, conducted under the glare of portable lights, the air thick with the stench of decay and the threat of biohazards. However, the environment inside the container proved to be a forensic nightmare. The years of moisture and grass, the fluctuating temperatures, and the pervasive rust and mold had degraded any potential biological evidence. The surfaces were covered in a thick layer of grime, making fingerprint recovery impossible. The mattresses and clothing remnants were so decayed that any DNA present had long since broken down. Despite the most advanced forensic techniques available in 2008, the site was forensically barren. The perpetrator had not only hidden the crime scene, time and nature had effectively sterilized it. The discovery of the container shattered the long-held theory that the Kinsley brothers had died in an accident during the storm. The narrative of a tragic flood was replaced by a far more sinister reality. It was now undeniably an abduction case. The storm, which had been seen as the cause of their disappearance, was now viewed as a tragic coincidence. The chaos and confusion caused by the weather had likely aided the abductor, providing cover for the crime and erasing any potential tracks. The investigation shifted focus. If the boys were abducted, how did the perpetrator manage to transport them deep into the forest and bury them in a pre-prepared prison without being detected? The key lay in the logistics of the operation. The use of heavy machinery was the most promising lead. Investigators began researching the history of the specific tract of land where the container was found. Land records revealed that while the area was state-owned, it had been leased in the mid-1990s to a small, independent construction aggregate company. The company specialized in quarrying stone and gravel operations that inherently involved the use of heavy equipment. This lease provided a plausible explanation for how someone might have had the access and the justification to operate excavators and bulldozers in the area without drawing immediate suspicion. The noise and disruption caused by the quarrying operation would have masked the noise and activity of burying the container. The perpetrator, authorities theorized, was likely connected to this company. The investigation now faced the daunting task of identifying and tracking down the individuals associated with the defunct operation. hoping to find a connection to the buried prison and the two boys who had been held captive within its rusted walls.
The discovery of the aggregate company Esliers on the land provided the investigation with its first concrete lead. The timeline matched. The company was active in the area in the mid-1990s, around the time the container must have been prepared and the boys disappeared. The logistics also aligned. The company had the heavy equipment necessary to bury a shipping container. The investigation pivoted sharply, focusing on identifying and tracking down anyone associated with the defunct operation. The company had gone out of business in the early 2000s, and the records were incomplete and disorganized. The task of compiling a list of former employees, contractors, and management was arduous, requiring investigators to track down scattered paperwork, tax records, and permits stored in dusty warehouses and private residences. The process took weeks, involving a team of analysts meticulously reconstructing the company's operations from fragmented data. As they dug deeper into the company's history, a murky picture began to emerge. Interviews with former employees and local residents revealed that the company had a reputation for cutting corners and operating on the fringes of legality. They were known for their disregard for environmental regulations, and there were persistent rumors that they used the leased state land for illegal dumping activities, burying hazardous materials to avoid disposal fees. The remote location and the lack of oversight provided the perfect cover for these illicit operations. This revelation led to the development of a compelling new theory. Perhaps the abduction was not the primary motive. Investigators hypothesized that the Kinsley brothers, exploring the area near the cave, might have stumbled upon the illegal dumping operation in progress. The workers, fearing exposure, might have panicked and silenced the boys. Using the shipping container, perhaps, it's already on site for storing equipment or materials as a temporary holding cell or even a makeshift tomb. This theory gained significant traction. It seemed a straightforward explanation for the involvement of heavy machinery and the presence of the container. It also aligned with the company's known shady practices. The motive shifted from predation to crime cover-up. It seemed more plausible than the idea of a solitary predator. Orchestrating such an elaborate abduction scenario in the midst of an active mining operation, the investigation focused intensely on the company's foreman from 1997. He was identified as a man with a significant criminal record, including multiple charges of assault and battery. He was known for his volatile temper and his willingness to use intimidation to enforce his authority. Former employees described him as ruthless and unpredictable, a man capable of violence and motivated to protect the company's illegal activities. He seemed like the prime suspect. Locating the former foreman took several weeks. He had moved to another state, living a transient lifestyle, working odd jobs in construction. FBI agents tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. The confrontation was tense. Agents prepared for a hostile reaction. Interrogation was aggressive. The agents confronted him with the evidence of the buried container and the disappearance of the Kinsley brothers. They pressured him about the company's activities in the Oak Haven forest, suggesting that the boys had seen something they weren't supposed to see. They painted a picture of a man desperate to protect his livelihood, willing to do anything to cover up his crimes. The former foreman was defiant and uncooperative at first, denying any knowledge of the container or the missing boys. He dismissed the allegations of illegal dumping as rumors spread by disgruntled former employees. But as the interrogation wore on and the agents hinted at potential federal charges for environmental crimes, his demeanor changed. He eventually admitted to the illegal dumping, confessed that the company had routinely buried barrels of toxic waste on the leased land, saving millions in disposal costs. He even provided details about the locations of the burial sites, seemingly resigned to the legal consequences of these actions. However, when questioned about the Kinsley brothers, he vehemently denied any involvement. He insisted that he had never seen the boys and had no knowledge of their disappearance. His denials seemed genuine, his frustration palpable, and critically, he provided a detailed, verifiable alibi for the day of the abduction. Claimed he was attending an equipment auction in a neighboring county several hours away from the Oak Haven forest. Investigators were skeptical. Coincidence seemed too convenient. They meticulously checked his alibi, pulling financial transaction records, hotel receipts, and interviewing witnesses from the auction. The evidence was conclusive. The alibi held up. Financial transaction records, including receipts from the auction and gas station purchases, confirmed his presence at the auction. Witnesses at the auction also corroborated his story. Timeline was tight, making it virtually impossible for him to have been involved in the abduction. The former foreman was cleared of involvement in the disappearance of the Kinsley brothers. The collapse of the aggregate company theory was a significant setback. The investigation was back to square one with a buried prison, 2 missing boys, and no viable suspects. The frustration among the investigative team was immense. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit urged the investigators to refocus on the evidence found inside the container. The BO emphasized that the nature of the items found, the mattresses, the CD player, the comic books, the long-term supply of food wrappers, suggested a captivity scenario with a caretaker dynamic. This was fundamentally inconsistent with a quick crime cover-up motive. If the boys had been killed to silence them, the perpetrators would likely have disposed of the bodies quickly and discreetly. They would not have set up a long-term living space providing food, entertainment, and bedding. The evidence pointed toward a solitary abductor, a predator who had planned the abduction meticulously and intended to keep the boys captive for an extended period. The aggregate company's activity in the forest was not the source of the crime, but rather the cover. The perpetrator had likely used the noise, disruption, and presence of heavy machinery to conceal his own activities. The investigation shifted back toward identifying this solitary abductor, a shadow figure who had operated undetected within the chaos of the quarrying operation. The question remained: who had the access, the skills, and the motive to commit such a horrific crime? Investigation now focused on the periphery, looking for the anomaly that would lead them to the truth. With the aggregate company theory dismissed and traditional investigative avenues exhausted, the investigation stalled once again. The lack of forensic evidence inside the container made identifying the perpetrator seem almost impossible. The investigators were left with the container itself, a rusting enigma buried in the forest floor. They decided to return to the physical evidence, focusing specifically on the unique, sophisticated modifications made to the container. The key to identifying the perpetrator lay in understanding how the container was constructed and buried. The ventilation system was the most distinctive feature. It was not a standard off-the-shelf solution. It was a custom-built system designed to provide adequate airflow to the buried container, while remaining hidden from the surface. It utilized specific high-grade industrial components, specialized inline fans, HEPA filters, and heavy-duty ductwork, not typically available to the general public or standard construction workers. These components were specialized, designed for industrial applications, requiring high reliability and durability. They were the kind of components used in specialized HVAC heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems in commercial buildings, hospitals, or industrial facilities. This indicated that the perpetrator had specialized knowledge and access to specialized equipment. Investigators hypothesized that the perpetrator must have had specialized knowledge and access to these components. They decided to trace the origin of the ventilation parts, hoping to identify the purchaser. They contacted the manufacturer of the specialized fans and filters, identified by the serial numbers still visible on the components. The manufacturer, recognizing the gravity of the investigation, cooperated fully, providing a list of regional distributors who sold these specific components in the mid-1990s. The task of tracing the sales records from over a decade earlier was daunting. Many of the distributors had gone out of business or had purged their old records. However, one distributor, a large industrial supply company, still maintained archived sales records. The records were stored on microfilm, requiring painstaking manual review. The process took weeks, involving a team of analysts meticulously reviewing thousands of transactions. Investigators focused on cash sales or small orders, transactions that might not be easily traceable to a specific company or individual. They were looking for anyone who purchased these specialized components in the period leading up to the Kinsley brothers' disappearance. They were searching for a needle in a haystack, hoping for a breakthrough in the mountain of data. The search yielded hundreds of transactions. The investigators then began the painstaking process of cross-referencing the sales records with individuals known to have access to the Oak Haven forest area, but who were not direct employees of the aggregate company. They were looking for someone who operated on the periphery, someone who might have gone unnoticed. A match was found. A cash transaction for 2 specialized inline fans and several HEPA filters dated March 1997, for months before the abduction. The purchaser had provided a name but no company affiliation. The name was Orson Blythe. Investigators ran a background check on Orson Blythe. The results were immediate and alarming. Blythe was a solitary HVAC specialist. He operated his own small business specializing in the installation and maintenance of complex HVAC systems. He had the specialized knowledge and skills required to design and build the ventilation system found in the container. Furthermore, Blythe was connected to the Oak Haven forest area. He worked as a subcontractor, occasionally hired by the aggregate company for specialized maintenance on their heavy equipment's climate control systems. This provided him with legitimate access to the area and the knowledge of the company's operations. He was also contracted by the state to service remote utility stations near the forest. This provided him with even broader access to the area, including the knowledge of the terrain and the ability to operate unnoticed. His utility truck, laden with equipment and supplies, could move in and out of the wilderness without drawing attention. He was a ghost moving through the forest unnoticed, but it was the deeper background check that solidified Blythe as the prime suspect. Investigators discovered that he had briefly volunteered with a different Boy Scout troop in the early 1990s. He had served as an assistant scoutmaster for less than a year. The records were vague, but interviews with the troop leaders revealed a troubling history. Blythe had been quietly asked to leave the troop due to unspecified boundary issues and inappropriate attention toward the children. The troop leaders spoke of incidents where Blythe seemed overly focused on certain boys, offering them private lessons and gifts, making them uncomfortable. There were allegations of favoritism, inappropriate physical contact, and obsessive behavior towards certain boys. No formal charges were ever filed, but the concerns were serious enough to warrant his removal. The profile matched the behavioral analyst's predictions. A solitary, meticulous planner with specialized skills, access to the location, and a disturbing history of predatory behavior toward young boys, indicators of pedophilia. The evidence was circumstantial, but the specificity of the ventilation components combined with Blythe's background and access made him the most compelling suspect the investigation had identified. The focus shifted entirely to Orson Blythe. The shadow figure finally had a name. The investigation now shifted towards locating Orson Blythe and confronting him with the evidence. Hoping to finally uncover the truth about what happened to the two Boy Scouts who vanished in the storm. The investigation moved quickly. Authorities located Orson Blythe, now in his late 50s, still living in a nearby county, resided in a small, isolated house on the outskirts of town, maintaining the reclusive lifestyle that had characterized his past. He was still working in the HVAC industry, operating his small business from a workshop attached to his home. The FBI placed Blythe under surveillance, monitoring his movements and activities. He appeared to be a man of routine, predictable, and unremarkable. They observed his movements, noting his solitary routines and his meticulous attention to detail in his work. He interacted with very few people, mostly clients and suppliers. He seemed unremarkable, invisible, but the surveillance confirmed that he still possessed the technical skills and the access to specialized equipment that had been used in the construction of the buried prison. Based on the highly specific circumstantial evidence linking him to the container's specialized parts, his access to the site, and his disturbing history with the Boy Scouts, the FBI secured a search warrant for Blythe's property. They decided to execute the warrant early in the morning, hoping to catch him off guard. The raid was swift and decisive. A tactical team descended on Blythe's property, securing the house and the workshop. They moved swiftly, breaching the door and securing the premises. They found Blythe inside the house, seemingly preparing for his workday. He appeared startled and confused by the sudden arrival of the agents, but he did not resist arrest. He remained silent as he was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car. The search of the property began immediately. The house was neat and organized, reflecting Blythe's meticulous nature. Investigators searched every room, looking for any evidence linking him to the Kinsley brothers or the buried container. They did not find the typical trophies often associated with serial predators. No photographs, no stolen belongings, no souvenirs of the crime. But in the workshop, amidst the tools and equipment of his trade, they found something far more incriminating. The workshop was meticulously organized, every tool in its place, reflecting Blythe's obsessive attention to detail. In a locked filing cabinet hidden among legitimate business records, they uncovered a set of detailed architectural drawings and schematics. The drawings depicted a buried shipping container, complete with the complex ventilation system found at the crime scene. The specifications matched the container's unique construction precisely. The level of detail was staggering, including precise measurements, materials, lists, and installation instructions. It was a blueprint for a prison. The discovery of the schematics was the smoking gun. It was irrefutable proof that Blythe had designed and built the buried prison. Further search of the workshop revealed more incriminating evidence. They found receipts for the rental of heavy equipment, an excavator and a bulldozer dated March 1997, the same month he purchased the specialized ventilation components. The rental company was located in a neighboring county, suggesting he had deliberately avoided local suppliers to minimize the risk of detection. The rental agreement listed Blythe as the operator, confirming his ability to transport and bury the container independently. In a dusty box hidden in the attic of the workshop, they found the most disturbing evidence of all: a collection of unsent letters, dozens of them, written over a period of several years. The letters were obsessive and delusional, addressed to R&J. They detailed a bizarre, twisted fantasy of a shared life, a hidden family, living in an underground sanctuary. The letters revealed a deeply disturbed mind, obsessed with control and possession. They chronicled the daily routines within the container, the psychological manipulation employed by Blythe, and his attempts to create a twisted version of a family dynamic. Blythe was brought to the FBI field office for interrogation. He was placed in a small, sterile room, the atmosphere tense with the weight of the impending confrontation. He was initially calm and composed, maintaining his facade of innocence. He denied any knowledge of the Kinsley brothers or the buried container. He claimed he was being framed, that the evidence had been planted. The interrogation was methodical and relentless. The agents confronted him with the physical evidence recovered from his home. They laid out the schematics on the table, comparing them to the photographs of the container's ventilation system. They showed him the receipts for the heavy equipment rental and the specialized ventilation components. They read excerpts from the letters, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Blythe's composure began to crack. His denials became less convincing, his demeanor more agitated. The agents pressed him, focusing on the meticulous planning, the specialized skills, the predatory motive. They emphasized the gravity of the situation and the overwhelming evidence against him. Finally, confronted with the irrefutable proof of his involvement, Blythe's resistance crumbled. He confessed. The confession was detailed and horrifying, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone. He admitted to the abduction of Ronan and Jarrett Kinsley, recounted how he had seen the brothers heading into the woods on July 12, 1997, just as the storm was beginning. He knew the area well, and he knew about the cave they frequented. He had been watching them for weeks, planning the abduction. He approached them in his utility truck, offering them a ride, claiming he could take them to shelter from the storm. The boys, trusting and desperate to escape the rain, accepted the offer. Once inside the truck, Blythe incapacitated them with chloroform and transported them to the container, which he had prepared months in advance. The container had been waiting, a buried prison designed specifically for this purpose. He also admitted to a chilling detail that explained the initial confusion of the investigation. He confessed that after securing the boys in the container, had returned to the cave and tied the specific knot to the exposed root system. He knew Ronan was proud of his knot-tying skills, and he knew the discovery of the knot would focus the search on an accidental death. Diverting suspicion away from an abduction, misdirection was calculated and effective, ensuring the search focused on an accidental death and diverting suspicion away from him. It was a masterful stroke of deception that had worked for 11 years. Blythe revealed the horrific details of their captivity. He described how he had kept them imprisoned in the buried container for years, bringing them food, water, and supplies. He described his attempts to create a twisted version of a family, forcing the boys to participate in his delusional fantasies. But Ronan, the older brother, never acquiesced. He constantly fought back, resisting Blythe's control and attempting multiple escapes. He encouraged Jarrett to resist as well, maintaining a fierce determination to survive. Ronan's defiance enraged Blythe, leading to escalating confrontations. Several months into the captivity, during a violent confrontation inside the container, Blythe killed Ronan. He admitted to strangling him in a fit of rage after Ronan had managed to damage the ventilation system in an escape attempt. The confession was chilling in its detachment. Blythe described the murder with the same meticulous detail he used to describe the construction of the container. The investigators pressed him about the location of Ronan's body. They needed to recover the remains to provide the Kinsley family with some measure of closure. Under pressure, Blythe agreed to lead them to the burial site. He directed the investigators to a separate location in the Oak Haven forest, several miles from the container. It was a remote area characterized by dense underbrush and rocky terrain. He pointed to a spot beneath a large oak tree. The excavation began immediately. The investigators dug carefully, their movements precise and deliberate. After several hours of digging, the investigators uncovered human remains. Remains were skeletal, consistent with a body buried for over a decade. Forensic analysis later confirmed the identity of the remains. Ronan Kinsley had finally been found. The discovery was heartbreaking, but it provided the confirmation that the Kinsley family had been desperately seeking. The investigation had achieved a partial victory, but the fate of the younger brother Jarek remained unknown. The recovery of Ronan's remains brought a measure of closure to the Kinsley family, confirming their worst fears, but ending the agonizing uncertainty about his fate. However, the fate of the younger brother Jarek remained an agonizing mystery. When investigators pressed Orson Blythe about what happened to Jarek, his detailed and detached confession suddenly became evasive and contradictory. Blythe claimed that after Ronan's death, Jarek became completely withdrawn and unresponsive, his spirit broken. He insisted that several years later, around 2001, Jarek managed to escape. According to Blythe, he had returned to the container to restock supplies and found the hatch open and Jarek gone. He claimed that Jarek had somehow managed to force open the reinforced locks, a feat that seemed highly improbable given the construction of the hatch and Jarek's age and physical condition after years of captivity. Blythe insisted that he searched the surrounding area but found no trace of Jarek. He claimed he then abandoned the container entirely, fearing that Jarek would lead the authorities to him. Investigators strongly doubted Blythe's account. The story of Jarek's escape seemed self-serving and inconsistent with the meticulous control Blythe had exerted over every aspect of the captivity. Authorities believed that Blythe murdered Jarek as well, perhaps when he became too old to control, or perhaps in the immediate aftermath of Ronan's death. They suspected that Blythe refused to disclose the location of Jarek's body as a final measure of control, a way to maintain power over the investigation and the victim's family. Or perhaps because he genuinely could not remember the exact location of the burial site after so many years. Furthermore, investigators believed that Blythe's claim of fully abandoning the container was not the entire truth. The meticulous design and construction of the buried prison suggested a long-term plan, a permanent fixture designed for repeated use. Authorities speculated that Blythe likely kept the container maintained over the years, playing with the thought of more victims, waiting for the opportunity to strike again. The site represented the physical manifestation of his darkest fantasies, something he would be reluctant to completely relinquish. The discovery of the container by the loggers had likely thwarted his future plans. Orson Blythe was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Ronan Kinsley and the kidnapping of Jarek Kinsley. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, the schematics, the receipts, the confession, and the recovery of Ronan's remains, he pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The recovery of Ronan's remains provided the Kinsley family with confirmation of his fate, allowing them to finally lay him to rest. However, because Jarek's body was never found, and Blythe refused to admit to his murder, the ultimate fate of the younger brother remains officially unresolved. The silence of the Oak Haven forest holds the final secret of the vanished Boy Scouts. The conviction of Orson Blythe brought a monster to justice, but it couldn't heal the wounds left by his horrific crimes. For the Kinsley family, the discovery of Ronan brought a heartbreaking end to one search. But the mystery of what truly happened to young Jarek remains an open wound, question mark that hangs over the forest to this day. The story of Ronan and Jarek is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight and the importance of never giving up the search for answers. Thank you for joining us for this investigation. If this story moved you, please help keep the memory of these boys alive by sharing it. To support our work and see more deep dives into complex cases, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We want to hear from you. What part of this case will stay with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe.